Today, we're thrilled to be hosting Richard Hasen for the release of his book, Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. Hasen is a professor of law and political science at UC Irvine and has been named one of National Law Journal's 100 most influential lawyers. In his most recent book, he looks back at the 2016 presidential and 2018 midterm elections to identify the reasons for the growing distrust of the American electoral system. Hasen provides an in-depth examination of cases of voter suppression, incompetence in election administration, foreign and domestic misinformation campaigns, and partisan rhetoric. In these examples, you begin to understand the devastating effects one party in particular has had on shaping elections and the impact they've had on voter turnout with voter suppression efforts. Thankfully, he does not leave us with the same distrust, discontent with the other news media that might be bombarding us, but with an optimism that we can combat voter suppression, misinformation, if we take the steps today. In Election Meltdown, Hasen offers concrete steps that we can take to restore trust in American elections before the democratic process is completely undermined. It couldn't have come sooner. Leading the conversation with Mr. Hasen today, we're honored to have Pam Fessler, an NPR news correspondent, where she covers poverty, philanthropy, and voting issues, including election security. You can be on the lookout for her forthcoming book as well, out July 14th. And please join me in welcoming both authors to the talk.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, you think I know how to use a microphone. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming, and this could not be a more timely topic as election officials around the country are preparing to get ready for the 2020 elections. And I wanted to put first, before I ask Rick his first question, put this into a little bit of context. What we are mostly talking about is the public's confidence in the election system. And NPR, PBS, NewsHour, and Mass, we just recently did a poll about this, and it came up with some kind of startling results. These are not majorities, but they are certainly huge shares of the American public. 44% of Americans think that it's likely that many votes will not be counted in 2020. That's 44%. 37% think that a foreign country will tamper with votes to change the results. Just over half think there will be voter fraud, and that includes 74% of Republicans, and 41% of Americans don't think the country's prepared to fend off an attack on our elections. These are pretty astounding numbers. So, Rick, do voters have a reason to be so worried, and why?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you to Politics and Prose, and I'm really honored to be here with Pam. And I didn't say the name of your new book, but so I'll let you do that before.
That's okay. Later on.
All right. Pam covers voting rights and election security issues on NPR, and really, if you want to keep up with what's going on, Pam is your number one source. So I do think that there is reason to be worried that if we have a very close election, that the chances of a post-election problem are real. Just like in the case of a nuclear reactor, there might be only a small risk of a meltdown. You take lots of precautions because the consequences would be so dire. And I think we need to do the same thing here. There's so much polarization right now. There's so much concern about the election, some of it driven from the president himself calling election results into question. And I think we've taken for granted the idea that when one president is voted out of office, there's a peaceful transition, or when a president is reelected, that the losers accept the results and say, all right, we'll fight again next time. I'm less certain that we're going to have that. And that's so different than 10 years ago. I went back and I looked at a blog post I wrote on my election law blog when Barack Obama was inaugurated. And this was George W. Bush, conservative Republican, going out of office. Barack Obama, liberal Democrat, coming into office. There was pomp and circumstance, and there was a lot of congratulations. And Republicans would just fight another day. And it was kind of a moment of celebration. I remarked on this blog post how we take for granted these peaceful transitions. And I think just a little bit more than a decade later, we can't take it for granted anymore. There are all kinds of reasons why trust in the democratic process and trust in our elections, more specifically, is going down. And so that's the impetus for writing this book.
So one of the things you do really nicely, I think, in this book is you kind of categorize what are sort of the different scenarios and things that we have seen over the last few years that have led to this point. You talk a little bit about voter suppression, incompetence, dirty tricks, all the rhetoric we're hearing. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those
Sure.
different scenarios.
Yeah, so the book is basically making an argument that there are four principal reasons why trust in the electoral process, the American electoral process, is going down. And the first of those is what I wrote about in an older book in 2012 called The Voting Wars, the fight over voter fraud versus voter suppression. And back in 2012, I was like, the jury's still out on what we know about how elections are run and how fair they are and how much fraud there is. But now, 8 years after that book, I think what we've determined is that the amount of voter fraud in this country is very, very small. And I tell the story in the book. The book actually opens with what I consider to be the most important voting rights case so far of the 21st century, a case that most of you probably never heard about, a case called Fish versus Kobach, which was a case in Kansas. You all hear about voter ID laws, and I think voter ID laws actually tend to not depress the vote in very large numbers for reasons we can talk about. But this was a case about a different law. It said if you were registering to vote in Kansas for the first time, you had to provide documentary proof of citizenship. You had to provide a birth certificate or a naturalization certificate that could prove that you were an American citizen. And at the time that this case went to court, 30,000 people has had their registrations suspended. And if a court did not intervene and put an injunction that required the registration of those people would not have been registered. And the main reason for this law was Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas, one of the people who goes around saying voter fraud is this large problem. Chris Kobach had to prove that non-citizen voting in Kansas was a big problem. He called it what he knew already, the tip of the iceberg. And here was the trial. Here was the chance to actually put it to the evidence. And I go through the trial. There's some funny moments of the trial, which I talk about in the book, including where the expert tries to prove that there was a lot of non-citizen voting by having he and his graduate assistant code names on this list of 30,000 voters that sounded foreign. And the ACLU's lawyer, Dale Ho, says, what about the name Carlos Murguia? Does that sound foreign? And he says, yeah, that sounds foreign. Do you know that that's a judge in this courthouse? Oh, no, I didn't know that. So this was the chance to actually prove it. And the judge concluded, this is a Republican-appointed judge, fourth-generation Kansan. She says, there is no iceberg, there's just an icicle. And I'd say it's an evaporating puddle of an argument. It's not even an icicle. And what the laws that make it harder for people to vote in the name of preventing voter fraud do is they convince both Republicans and Democrats that the system is rigged. It convinces Republicans that voter fraud is rampant, and you heard those NPR statistics. And it convinces Democrats that Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. And I think there's no question now that these laws, not passed in every state and not passed by all Republicans, but these laws are aimed at trying to make it harder to register and to vote. They don't always succeed in doing that, but that seems to be the aim because they're not justified by any social science evidence showing voter fraud or that it's needed to promote voter confidence. And so I start off talking about this voter fraud, voter suppression issue, and then I turn to three other issues, which we can get to in the questions. The second is pockets of election incompetence. And that's as big a problem. I think you're more likely to be disenfranchised if you live in Broward County, Florida, with its Democratic administration than you are if you live in Kansas because of poor election administration. Less sexy topic, but actually, I think, substantially more important. And then there's dirty tricks. There's not just the Russian misinformation. There's also all kinds of old-fashioned ballot tampering, which occurs rarely, but gets a lot of coverage in the news. We heard a lot about the North Carolina 9th Congressional District. And then the last thing I talk about is this tendency, not just of Trump, but of Democrats as well, on the losing end of an election to say that it's stolen or rigged. And the most prominent example here is Stacey Abrams, who said in the Georgia election, Georgia governor's election in 2018, after Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State running the election, did some things that were, I think, pretty terrible, but no good evidence that she actually won her election, which is what she sometimes has claimed. And so I think talking about elections as stolen undermines people's confidence too. So these four things together are the reason why I think you're getting the statistics that you're getting in this NPR survey.
You know, it's interesting too. I was just at a conference here in DC of all the state election officials were in here this weekend talking about preparing for the 2020 elections. And so they are, of course, concerned about a lot of these things, but they also seem to be very concerned about the possibility of things that it doesn't come under the incompetence category, but disruptions that you might not have control over. Things like ransomware. They're so worried about ransomware now. They're so worried about not only disinformation, but just somebody coming in and causing chaos. You know, not necessarily changing votes, but making voters think that they can change votes. And then also the other thing is just disruptions. What happens with the electric grid? You know, if something goes down, maybe you can talk a little bit about those possibilities.
Yeah, and so one of the things I spin out is the possibility that the Russian government or other actors could target the power grid in a democratic city in a swing state. Think Detroit or think Milwaukee. First of all, there's pretty good evidence that not only have the Russians been able to do this in the Ukraine, and I tell the story of how they hacked the Ukrainian power grid and brought down power to the extent that it could have caused serious damage in the winter when pipes would freeze and there'd be all kinds of problems. But also that there was this Wall Street Journal expose about a year ago about hacking into the American power grid. And so there is reason to believe that this kind of thing could happen. And part of the problem is a technological problem. It's a cybersecurity problem. Part of it is a legal problem because, as Norm Ornstein has written in the Washington Post, we don't have a plan B in a lot of states. So imagine that the power goes down in Detroit on election day, and it's a presidential election. I asked the Secretary of State of Michigan about this, Jocelyn Benson, for a podcast that I'm doing on Slate called Election Meltdown, which you can download at Slate. And I asked her, I said, what would happen? She said, well, we would have provisional ballots. These are ballots that are at the polling places. If there's some kind of problem, people can write on pencil and paper. Okay, even if there's enough ballots, imagine what it would be for people to try to get to the polling place if all the traffic lights are out. Right? How many people are going to stay home? And then, of course, there would be the call, well, if Trump wins Michigan and Trump wins the electoral college because he wins Michigan, but the vote in Michigan is skewed because of this, there's no law that says, okay, let's have a do-over, or here's how or we're going to throw out Michigan's votes entirely. There's no plan B. And so whether it's ransomware or attacks on the voter registration databases, which can affect the so-called electronic poll books, there's all kinds of things that could go wrong. And I do think that both the federal government and state and local governments are aware of this. They're fighting the 2016 war, right? They know all the things that happened last time. I'm worried about the new stuff that might happen this time. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a foreign actor. It could be a domestic actor that's engaged in this. So I think, and a lot of these things, there's a lot we can do to try to improve things, like fixing our laws. There's not much that you and I can do. We can lobby to fix more laws. There's not much we can do about cybersecurity. That's really in someone else's hands. And so that is frightening. And I think it's even out of the hands of a lot of election officials who have limited budgets and who, you're a small election office in a small county. What are you going to do? We don't run a single election in this country on election day for president. We run something like 9,000 elections. And so, your election system is only as strong as the weakest links in that chain.
Right, and one of the interesting things is we have, as you well know, election offices that might only have one person who runs the entire election office, but they also have 5 other jobs. And so, this is something that they'll do just periodically, and they don't have IT people, they don't, they don't have enough equipment, so one of the things that the election officials that I talk to, one of the things they're trying to do is get the message out that voters themselves kind of need to be prepared to be resilient if anything's happen. But it sounds like when they say resilient, what does that mean? I mean, what options do voters have?
Well, so if resilient could mean if the lights are out, find your way to get to a polling place. Right. But that's really that's limited, and I think we need to. It's now about 9.5 months before the election. I think we need to think about having laws in place that deal with an election that goes wrong because of outside interference. And we don't have that. And, you can imagine a legal dispute over Michigan's electoral votes, electoral college votes, going to the Supreme Court, kind of like 2000 Bush versus Gore. Would that solve the problem? And I'm afraid it wouldn't, because, as polarizing as Bush versus Gore was in 2000, divide 5-4, conservatives versus liberals. You may remember the two of those liberals were David Souter and John Paul Stevens, both Republican-appointed justices. Now all the conservatives on the court were appointed by Republican presidents. All the liberals were appointed by Democratic presidents. We're thinking of the Supreme Court more and more as a partisan institution. Look at the attacks on John Roberts over the last few weeks as he's been running the Senate impeachment. And so would a Neil Gorsuch fifth vote, the stolen seat of Merrick Garland, as Democrats say, would a vote to do something that would help Trump stay in office be accepted by Democrats? And, it's hard to think about. But we can't, there's only so much we can do about the technology. But do we have a legal infrastructure in place to deal with that kind of problem? And I'm not sure that we do.
Which brings me to my next question, and I want to read, before we start talking about solutions and why people shouldn't be quite so depressed.
No, they should be, but go ahead. They shouldn't be so depressed that they don't buy the book, but they should.
I don't think they should be so depressed. So you do raise this one possibility that I would like to talk to about what are the solutions and what could happen, and it's on page 121 here, and it says you talk about this interview that Nancy Pelosi gave to the New York Times, in which she, quote, expressed concern that President Trump might not leave office voluntarily if defeated in 2020. And then later you quote Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, testifying before the House Oversight Committee, who said, quote, given my experience working for Mr. Trump, I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, there will never be a peaceful transition of power. Now, whether it's Trump or somebody else, what are the options if, in fact, an incumbent president says, I don't think this election is legitimate, I'm not leaving?
Okay, so before answering that, let me give a more plausible scenario as to how we might get there that just came up over the last few weeks, which is that Pennsylvania, which is a state like New York, had no real early voting. Pennsylvania changed its rules. It was a compromise between the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature. They made a bunch of changes, but one of the changes is they're now allowing absentee ballots to be cast without an excuse. So you can vote early, which is a great thing because lots of people are not available on election day or don't want to wait in a 5-hour line. But what election officials are saying, and Jocelyn Benson is saying the same thing in Michigan, expecting a flood of these absentee ballots, election administrators who are not prepared to count them all in time. Trump could be ahead in a swing state like Pennsylvania or Michigan on election night. You look at the vote totals when you turn on CNN or Fox News, it's going to show Trump in the lead. Trump could then declare victory and say, stop counting the votes. The votes on election night are the best votes. Now, that may sound far-fetched, but he said that exact thing about the 2018 election when it was Rick Scott against Bill Nelson in the Florida U.S. Senate race, where there was a recount in that race. Election night is good. The later ballots are massively infected with fraud. So he could throw this into question. What are the things that could happen? One of the things that could happen is there could be the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania says that the Democrat is the winner, but the Republican legislature sends a competing slate of electors to the Electoral College in the name of Trump. And then it will be up to Congress to decide who the president is, counting these votes under a system where each state House delegation gets one vote. And there are more Republican state House delegations than there are Democratic. Even though there's more Democrats in the House, it's not one House member, one vote. It's one state, one vote. So you could have competing slates of electors. I think what the impeachment taught us is that Republicans will fall lockstep with whatever Trump says. So it's quite possible that what happens is Trump, it's not that he won't leave office, he's been found to be the loser, everybody agrees he's the loser, it's that he claims he's the winner. He claims that if he lost, it was because of fraud, and then that would have to get adjudicated by maybe state legislatures or maybe by Congress. And so that sounds like a situation of civil unrest. Now, it sounds far-fetched, and I hope that I'm being an alarmist, but it seems to me that it's within the realm of possibility in a way that it would not have been even a decade ago. I think we've just moved, things have deteriorated so much. Because in the impeachment trial, I just found that the Republicans were saying things that were demonstrably false. And that is worrisome to me.
Was this something that the founders ever envisioned?
Well, remember, there was when we had the choice of the president, we had the Electoral College, the electors. So Article 2 of the Constitution says that the electors are chosen under the rules set by the state legislature. And state legislatures didn't have popular election of the president. It was up to the state legislatures to do it. So, eventually we moved to a position where every state now uses the popular vote within the state to choose the electors. But no, the Constitution doesn't speak to this at all. And it leaves it to a political body, Congress. And of course, it's not just to Congress. It's not just to the House based on the House election results. It's based on states. And so state delegations. And if there are more Republican states than Democratic states, regardless of where the popular vote falls, you could have a potentially disruptive outcome there.
So now let me ask you if, and this is why we will disagree on this probably, okay. Why I think people maybe shouldn't be quite so pessimistic. We actually probably have safer, more accurate elections today than we've ever had before. Would you disagree with that?
I think it depends on where you're talking about.
Yeah.
I would say overall in the country, you're much more likely to cast a vote that won't be miscounted because of bad machines than before. I think that's true. And I think we have less, over the last 50 years, we have less fraud in our elections than we've ever had. So I wouldn't say that I'm pessimistic. What I would say is that I'm concerned about a low probability catastrophic event. And I think people underestimate the possibility of that happening. Maybe it's 5% chance. That's still a huge percentage chance. You know this, Pam, but lots of people don't. The best way to prevent a contested election is for it not to be close. There's the election administrator's prayer. Lord, let this election not be close. Because when it's close, then everything gets put under a microscope. And that's that quote from Nancy Pelosi, you read part of it. But the other part, this was just before the 2018 congressional elections, where, remember, the Republicans controlled the House, and then it switched to the Democrats. And what Pelosi said after she won, after her side won, was, we can't win by 3 or 4 seats because Trump will fight those 3 or 4 seats and he will claim that Republicans still control the House. We have to win by a lot. And I think the idea is if it's a landslide, then these problems fall by the wayside because even if there's a problem here or there, it's not going to affect the outcome. It's if it's a very close election. And, you look at the polling and a really close election is something that's possible. And then all of the places where there's the weak links, that's where you potentially have a problem. So I wouldn't call myself pessimistic as much as I would call myself concerned, given the small probability of a high risk event.
Right. So what do you think we should do? Help.
Yes. So I divide the last chapter of the book after talking about the 4 reasons why I think we should have concerns. And I think we talked about all of them aside. We didn't talk much about the incompetence issue, which I think is a problem. I divide into short, medium, and long-term solutions. And long-term, I think, just working backwards, long-term, I think we have a crazy election system. If you look at look at other modern democracies, look at Australia, the UK, Canada, Germany, they have national, nonpartisan election administration. So you have one system. The ballots look the same everywhere. The machinery is the same everywhere. Civil servants are running that election. I think that's the model that we need. Now, in 2012, I proposed something like this in my book, The Voting Wars. I called for universal voter registration, where everybody's registered to vote automatically by the government, and a national voter ID card. And I like to say that this proposal united Democrats and Republicans, because it united them against it. The Democrats hated the voter ID portion, and the Republicans hated the universal voter registration portion. And we're much more polarized now. So it's hard to know how we get there. The other thing we need long-term is better civics education, so people understand that losers need to accept the results of a fair election and move on, right? And that is a very hard lesson to teach in a very polarized society. So I say, okay, we're not going to get that, but I think that would solve a lot of the problems. Greater professionalism, more money towards elections, uniformity, and competent election administration. Short of that, I mentioned the Supreme Court as the arbiter. That seems like a problem. I mentioned the possibility that that this could be decided by the political branches where we don't have the same kind of responsible party leaders, especially on the Republican side that we used to have. So what can we do now? So there's a few things that can be done. One thing, and I'm convening a conference at the end of the month at UC Irvine. You'll be able to watch it live. It's called Can American Democracy Survive the 2020 Elections? And we're bringing together people from law, tech, politics, and media to say, triage, what can we do in the next 9 months to try to make things better? So top of my list, the media needs to be careful when they describe who's winning an election, not only to not call an election, but to explain that there are thousands of votes that are left to be counted, or hundreds of thousands of votes, or in California, millions of votes. And also we know from social science that those votes tend to be Democratic. It used to not be this way, but those late counting votes tend to be Democratic. That's why all of those races in California for Congress that started off with the Republican in the lead ended up with Democrats as those ballots were counted. So the media needs to do better education. Election administrators need to have a plan B, and state legislatures need to have a plan B. It's not too late, or Congress, it's not too late to start thinking about what if there's a natural disaster? What if there's a hurricane in Florida just before the election, which is also possible? How are we going to deal with that? So all of these are things, in each area. Facebook has a responsibility, which we could talk about, so the role of social media. In every area, there are things that could be done to minimize the chances. And also bipartisan condemnation of statements like the president's that 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants voted in coincidentally, the same amount of people by which he lost the popular vote. 3 million people voted illegally. I mean, this should be condemned by both sides, and that's hard to get.
Just to be fair, in Florida, they do have very extensive plans on how to deal if a hurricane hits the elections.
Okay,
they have a polling precinct in a box, and I went to their planning sessions.
Yes, let me give you a counterpoint to that, which I describe in the book. If there's a hurricane and there's a problem, what do you do about it? Well, you're allowed to accept ballots that come in a little later. You're allowed to let people vote outside the polling place. What you're not allowed to do is let people vote by email or fax. Right. And yet, an election administrator in Bay County accepted ballots that were illegally cast, even under the contingency rules, that were, I think you had a report on this, that were submitted by email, right? The least secure way to do it. And not only did he get away with it, he got a standing ovation at the meeting of all of the Florida election administrators for breaking the law. I mean, imagine if the election turned on the acceptance of emailed ballots. I mean, just think about what that would look like if that were the presidential election. It would be, Bush versus Gore 2, but with social media now and outside interference. So I'm sorry to take your one bit of optimism and
Okay, I'm going to keep working on that. Anybody else have any questions? I think Mike. Sorry.
So, two things. You haven't talked about purging voter rolls, reducing the number of early voting opportunities, reducing the number of polling places selectively in Democratic areas. You take away a few polling spaces so that the lines are longer in the hour, and you keep the hours short. That's one set of things. The other thing is you haven't really talked about the Russians, and I think there's probably a lot more that we don't know because Trump is hiding it. But in 2016, didn't the Russians target the Bernie supporters and tell them bad things about Clinton and that could happen again now. And Trump, you remember the meeting with Putin where some reporter asks him about election interference, and Trump smiles and says to Putin, now, don't interfere with our elections. What did that make you think?
So first on voter purges, this is where, long-term solution, we should have a rational system for registering voters where the federal government takes care of it. And you keep your voter registration for life. And as you move, your voter registration moves with you. In the short term, we need to have the cleaning of voting rolls because People move, people die, and they're not removed from voting rolls. So you need to have sound election administration principles. The question is when it's done too close to the election or done too aggressively. And I do think one of the solutions to that has been lawsuits to try to stop the most egregious efforts to make it harder to vote. And in the courts, I think we've seen it's been a mixed result. Sometimes the courts will interfere with an attempt to make it harder. Sometimes they won't. I certainly think more litigation to try to get rid of really aggressive voter purges close to the election is a good thing. In terms of the Russians, I talk about them a lot in the book. We didn't have a chance to talk about it much here. But it's not just the Russians. In the book, I talk about, I don't know if you remember the 2017 race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore for the U.S. Senate seat in Alabama. Well, it was a pro-Jones, not with Jones' support or knowledge. It was a pro-Jones group that pretended to be conservative Christians supporting Roy Moore and doing the same kind of social media disinformation that we saw the Russians do in 2017. I think we're going to see a lot of it, but we're going to see it not just coming from foreign sources, we're going to see it coming from domestic sources. And it turns out, thanks to the way our campaign finance laws are written, that most of the stuff that the Russians did not, on the social media manipulation, don't, blacktivist, African Americans don't vote for Hillary Clinton, no lives matter to Hillary Clinton, stay home. We're going to see more of that, but it's not just going to be the Russians, it's going to be domestic. And I think the effect of that is not necessarily that it's going to depress turnout. The effect of a lot of this and the effect of putting lies out on social media is that people will tend to disbelieve everything. We'll have what some other scholars have called the liar's dividend. People will be able to say, Trump is caught on the Access Hollywood tape. He's not said that wasn't my voice. Fake news. And so we're losing news media and we're losing trust in news media and the ability to have people who can tell us the difference between truth and fiction. So I think these are some serious problems, not just from external forces, but also from domestic sources.
And then just can you talk a little bit about the allocation of equipment, when you're talking about places that might have long lines because there are not enough precincts open or not enough equipment?
Right. So there's often a dispute over whether or not these are intentionally done in order to make it harder for Democrats to vote. And there's some evidence that happened in some places. And sometimes it's resource allocation and people haven't thought about. That's why you've got to be very aggressive in looking at those changes, especially last-minute changes, and going to court if necessary. And we've seen that happen. I don't know what your experiences are.
Well, I was just going to say that, it's a huge challenge trying to figure out, and right now, election officials are trying to figure that out because they are anticipating it's going to be one of the biggest turnout elections. And so the question is, where are people going to turn out? Are they going to actually come and vote, or are they going to vote? So many more people are going to be voting absentee. So to try and figure out when they have limited equipment, limited polling places, they also have to make sure that the polling places are fit for people with disabilities, that they're accessible. There's so many factors that go into it. And a lot of times it is, people say, oh, they're just doing it because they want to suppress the vote. But you kind of have to look at, it crosses each case, because a lot of times it's Democratic cities that don't have enough polling places. So part of it's because they don't have enough money. I'm sorry, what?
Polling places that used to be there.
Right.
That somehow we just don't have those. But in small, wealthy communities, plenty of polling places.
Yeah, because they have more tax revenue and they just have more money to spend on elections, which is a big issue.
Republicans cheat.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting, important subject for sure. I'm wondering about the history in the U.S. of having elections disrupted by either natural disasters or other technological problems in which the results of the election were probably determined by the effect. And, are there precedents where it may have been there may have been an electrical failure, or there may have been in other cases. In other words, is there a history that Republicans, for example, could point to say, well, this is part of the system. This is the way it works. If you don't get to vote for whatever reason, your vote doesn't count. Just just wondering, how much this problem has come up in the past.
So I'm not aware of, certainly in any presidential election where there's been the claim that there was some kind of interference. But we have had problems. 9/11 was an election day in New York, but it wasn't a presidential election, and so they could just say, you know what, we're going to rerun the election. You remember the this wasn't a natural disaster, but the Coleman-Franken race. This was for U.S. Senate. I'm forgetting the year, maybe 2008. In that election, it was so close. They said, you know what, we've got to do a recount. And they looked at the ballots and they did a great job, but it took 9 months. Right? We can't do that for president. Someone just wrote to me, and I haven't researched this yet, about a ballot measure election in Alaska over the treatment of Juneau, where the claim was that there was a power outage and it potentially affected the outcome of the election. And somebody claimed that was an intentional power outage, but I haven't looked into that yet. So I'm not aware of specific elections in the United States that have been disrupted. We've had disruptions in other countries where this has happened, but not in the United States at the presidential level, for sure.
So Superstorm Sandy was another one,
Right.
which hit right before Election Day. So they had to find all new voting places. Not only did they have to find new voting places, but there were all these people, these rescue workers who came in to help, who also had to make kind of alternative plans to vote, which was very
Right.
disruptive. The other one that I'm just thinking of, and it's not so much a technological, I mean, not a natural disaster, but we just had this election in Pennsylvania. Was it Northampton County, I believe? Yes. And the voting machines, and this is terrible, I'm going to totally get it wrong, but it was two candidates, and one got, 15,000 votes, and the other candidate got like 205. And it turns out that the voting machines, there was something that had been programmed incorrectly, and the people who were voting for one of the candidates, it was not registering on the final result. But this in Pennsylvania, they have they're in the process of switching all of their equipment so everything has a paper-based ballot. A paper ballot. So they were able to go back and check all the paper ballots and count them and realize that the guy who got 250 votes ended up winning, was the winner. But it's also pretty terrifying because they said that the reason, and this is when we talk about the margin of victory, the only reason people saw that was, it was clear there was a problem, that somebody only got 250 votes. But what if it was only, a difference of 500 or 600 votes? You might not have realized that.
Right. Well, it sounds like the decision, using the 9/11 example, the decision as to whether to redo a vote, even if it seems like an obviously needed thing, or in normal times, people would go along with that on both sides. But perhaps now, if we had, I don't know, if it's a natural disaster, I can't imagine that it wouldn't be an objection to redoing the election just because of a natural disaster.
It's not clear that for a presidential election you could have a redo. So we do have a little bit of precedent here. Do you remember the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County? That was where, all the Jews for Buchanan voters, if you remember that. In that election, Irwin Chemerinsky, my former boss, he was the dean of my law school, he went and argued on behalf of the Palm Beach County voters and said, we should have a redo of the election in Palm Beach County. And the court said, you can't redo a presidential election. There's no, presidential elections are different. The Constitution prescribes the election day, and you can't have a do-over. I mean, that's questionable, but there's a precedent the other way. I was going to mention about the voting machines. This is kind of hot off the presses, but the very latest voting technology is something called BMDs. You may have heard of DREs if you're a nerd, folks, any of this. Those are those electronic machines that didn't produce a piece of paper that Pam was talking about. The new machines are BMDs, ballot marking devices. You vote on the touchscreen, prints out a piece of paper, lists all your candidates, all your ballot measures, and it produces a barcode or a QR code. That QR code is then what's counted for the
some of
election.
them.
And you can look at
For
it
some of them.
and you can't tell. Well, no, I think that's what's actually counted. The dispute is, what if there's a recount? And Georgia now looks like it's moving to a system where if there's a recount, they'll just run the machine through the barcode again. They will not count the names that are actually on the ballot, which means if somebody misprograms how you count the barcodes, you're in big trouble. So you have to have post-election audits. This is another one of the things on my short-term list. You have to do something to make sure, like a random sample, that the results are being reported match the results that would be if you look at the piece of paper. You'd think that's what would happen, but there's fighting over these machines too. These machines are great for people with disabilities. They're great for people who have different languages because you can program them in different languages, but they also have problems. In Los Angeles County, where I live, the city of Beverly Hills has sued the county, which is part of the county of Los Angeles, has sued the county of Los Angeles because the way the machines are programmed, these brand new BMD machines, if you have, say, 6 candidates running for office, only 4 can be listed on the screen at a time. And then you can vote for one of those 4 without hitting more to go on to the next screen to see all the other lists of candidates. So there's all kinds of issues like nitty gritty, nobody's focused on it, and it's, technical, but wait till an election depends on it.
Right.
Hi. First off, I'm enjoying the podcast. Second, I work in advocacy spaces, and I'm often fascinated by the relative lack of interest in the health of the actual democracy, because it means everyone's running around thinking and doing good work, amplifying, how do we expand childcare access? How do we fight for LGBT rights? How do we end police violence, core things that we should be doing. But they're relying on a reliable system. They're relying on a system that people have faith in and that is fair. And it's not. I know you're fascinated by the big disaster scenarios, but the democracy we have right now is not working. Not in a hypothetical future or from a foreign invader, but just from our own complacency and apathy. And I'm wondering, to what do you attribute the lack of interest, both among the public and the donor class, that oftentimes drive these conversations? Why is there not a lot of philanthropic money behind sort of big changes, and has it been changing?
So I think that is a little bit beyond the topic of my book. And so I say, for example, I've got a lot of thoughts about the Electoral College and whether or not it's fair. I think it's not fair. But that's not what this book is. I'm concerned about the kind of the nuts and bolts. But I think, questions about why people are disengaged and why we're so polarized, those are really difficult questions. I mean, it's kind of beyond what I'm doing. They're perfectly valid things to raise. But I really tried to focus narrowly on, in this book, on what can we do to have a peaceful transition. Because if we don't have losers accepting election results, then we can't do any of these other things. Then we've really lost our democracy. So it's kind of a prerequisite to everything else.
Yeah, and I think it's somewhat related, though, to the disinformation, and that what you said before, people not knowing what to believe, or then deciding, well, I don't believe this, I'm only going to believe what I want to believe. And it just sort of undermining confidence, not only in the elections, but just the whole, democratic process.
Sorry, I'm bumming all of you out. I apologize.
You've both mentioned early voting as a phenomenon that has been in some areas limited, in some areas expanded. I'm wondering, do you have a count of how many states permit early voting, either by absentee ballot or, as we have it here in DC, by actually turning up at a location to vote early? And is that a guard of sorts against election day disaster?
Well, no, I don't know the exact number, Martha, but I think it's clearly a majority of states, and many more are going to it. Like just Virginia now is in the process of passing legislation that will allow no excuse absentee voting. And I think that's one thing we haven't really talked about. There have been a lot of changes over the past few years that actually have opened up and gotten rid of a lot of barriers to voting. Many more states have online voter registration. Many have
and many Republican states.
Yes,
this is
exactly.
not just a Democratic.
Yeah. Automatic voter registration, where you just go to the DMV when you change your address or just getting your driver's license, will automatically register you to vote if you're eligible. unless you opt out of it. There's much more early voting than there's ever been before, and then also the absentee ballot initiatives. So at least the election officials say, we're doing so much. You have a lot of these laws that have been passed over the past 8 years that have restricted voting, but probably equal, if not more, laws have been passed that have expanded opportunities to vote.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say early voting, not only it makes good sense in terms of fairness for people who have trouble voting on election day, it alleviates the burden on election administrators.
Right.
And it allows, if there's a problem, it allows it to be fixed in time. So it's considered that function.
One of the things I was wondering is whether it also spreads out the strain on the system and the lines issue on election day.
It can. In fact, I remember when Los Angeles moved to it's a rudimentary form of early voting. Now we're moving to vote centers with these new machines and a 2-week voting period. But on the first weekend, I remember the school near our house, the line was around the block because early voting. But at least if it's a Saturday, you can give up, 4 hours. It's different if it's a work day, and are people going to stay in line? I was on a panel in Texas a few years ago. Texas is a place where it's not so easy to vote. And they said, if you could make one change in the voting system, what would it be? And it was not early voting. It was online voter registration. Because in Texas, if you have to go to the motor vehicles department, it could be a few hundred miles away. It's just not so easy. And Texas has not adopted that. In fact, they were just sued because they're not offering, under federal law, something called the motor voter law. They have to offer voter registration opportunities at certain government offices, including motor vehicles department, and they weren't making it easy. On the other side, California and Illinois have both moved to this automatic voter registration, where if you go to the DMV and you get your license or renew, you're automatically registered to vote unless you don't want. But the DMVs are so incompetent that we've had non-citizens being registered to vote. We've had Republicans registered to vote as Democrats. We've had people who tried to register to vote who were opted out because you're asking people in the motor vehicle department to administer voter registration, which is, not their job. So, even in places where you try and make it easy, if you don't have the funding behind it, you don't have the infrastructure in place. In California, it looks like the Democratic Secretary of State wanted to rush it through in time for the 2018 elections before it was really ready. And, you ended up with all of these kinds of problems.
Which is, again, raises, these questions. I guess the one other thing, Martha, I was going to mention is that a lot of states also are now doing same-day voter registration, which, so an increasing number are moving in that direction. And that kind of addresses the whole idea, when we talk about whether people's names are on the voter rolls or voter purges. So that's an issue right now in Wisconsin. There's a lawsuit going on about removing names from the rolls there. And one of the things the election officials point out there, or people, is that you do have that option in Wisconsin to register on election day. So if something happens with the voter rolls in advance, there's this fallback.
But, we have seen this phenomenon, which I talk about in the book, of red state election law and blue state election law. So just like Republicans in some states are making it harder for some people to register and vote because that can help the Republican Party by shrinking the electorate. In some places, and I put California in this category, I think they're quickly trying to expand the electorate because they think they'll get more Democrats voting. So it would be nice if the people who are running our elections thought about what can we do to ensure that all eligible voters, but only eligible voters, can easily and fairly cast a vote that will be fairly and accurately counted. I mean, if that were the goal, that would be great, right? But it becomes a political, and it's always been political in this country, decentralized and partisan. After 2000, you remember Katherine Harris, the Republican Secretary of State, who was kept siding with Bush, and then you had the Democratic Attorney General Robert Butterworth, who people don't hear as much about. He wasn't even in the election field, but he was issuing opinions that were siding with Gore. So you'd think that since 2000, states would have moved to nonpartisan election administration. In fact, not only has no state done that, Florida took its elected partisan Secretary of State position and made it appointed by the governor, made it even more political. And Wisconsin, which had a national model of nonpartisan election administration, the Republican legislature got rid of that. So we've made things more partisan rather than less partisan. And Congress, after 2000, created an agency called the United States Election Assistance Commission, which Pam is probably the only other person in the room that's heard of them. It started, all it does is give advisory opinions and has 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Doesn't do very much now. But every year, the National Association of Secretaries of State, made up of Democrats and Republicans, has called for the agency to be disbanded. Why? Because they don't want a bigger federal role for elections. They want to keep the power for themselves. So besides the partisan issues, there's the turf war between federal, local, and state election officials.
Have there been cases where early ballots, absentee ballots, mailed-in ballots were lost or destroyed, and are there good provisions to deal with it?
Almost every election you hear a story, oh yeah, we found a box of ballots, right?
Like 2 months later.
Yes, the postal worker had them in her trunk, or in Broward County, I tell the story of Brenda Snipes, who was one of the worst election administrators in the country and stayed in office for years.
She's not there anymore.
Finally not there anymore, only because the governor forced her out. She was reelected as a Democrat in many elections. But in one election, she failed to send out 58,000 absentee ballots to people who requested them. In another election, she left a medical marijuana initiative off the ballot. She destroyed ballots before the time period in which they needed to be counted. Needed to be preserved, I should say. And in the 2018 election, and I tell this story in the chapter on poor election administration, they had to conduct a recount, 3 recounts, because the races, not just the Bill Nelson, Rick Scott race, but 2 other races were really close. And it was so close. What are you going to do about these 3 recounts? They missed the deadline by 2 minutes to submit their vote totals because they did not know how to operate the website to submit their vote totals. And then after they had done the recount, they actually produced 4,000 fewer votes in the recount than in the initial count, and the board voted to submit the initial count rather than the recount. I mean, just a disaster. And Snipes' answer was, we're a large jurisdiction, we do the best we can. And that can't be good enough.
I would say the only one thing, I actually, and I have no proof of this at all, but I would say that it's probably less likely these days that a box of ballots is going to go missing than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, just because so many people are watching now. I mean, the election process has so many people, outside groups, the campaigns, the election administrators, the media, are watching things so much more closely that I think these things are just less likely to occur. I'm not saying they don't occur, because they do, but my guess is that it's probably less common.
It still sounds kind of random. Is there a country that knows how to do this, that's getting it right, that has the procedures we should have?
Yeah, every other country. But no, one of the problems we have in the United States is that, in California, when we vote, it's like the phone book. You all remember what a phone book is, right? We're voting on 50 different things, literally. Ballot initiatives, Superior Court judge, all kinds of things. And in national elections in other countries, it's, do you want the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party? It's a very simple ballot. So it's a lot easier to count, a lot fewer things. But I do agree that everyone's watching, and that does make things better. The counterpoint to that for 2020 is, they're, as Pam suggested, they're predicting a tsunami of turnout. And places are going to be overwhelmed. It's going to take days to count ballots, and everyone's going to want to know. I mean, you could just picture the election countdown clock negative on CNN in the corner, right, going up and up and up, as opposed, it's like
day 5.
Day 5 of waiting to find out who won Pennsylvania. I think that is. I don't know that Pennsylvania is going to be decisive in the Electoral College, but it is really a realistic possibility that we will not know who's won some states for days.
And Pennsylvania is getting all new equipment this year. Machines that people are not used to using. This is the state where we had the county with the guy getting 250 votes.
Just like if you wrote a play, your first play, and you say, I'm going to start on Broadway. I'm not going to workshop it anywhere else. Right. That's what we're doing with our election system. Yes.
Can you say a few words about the role of the Justice Department in the upcoming elections? So the Department of Justice, well, first I should back up and say, and I should have said this in the answer to one of the earlier questions, one of the things that's changed in the last 10 years is that the Supreme Court decided a case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which said that a law that was part of the Voting Rights Act that said was unconstitutional, and that law said that jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination in voting had to get federal approval before they could make changes to their voting rules and prove that those changes would not make protected minority voters worse off. So a place like Georgia or Texas that wanted to close polling places couldn't do it without getting Justice Department approval. That protection is now gone. And the Department of Justice is not pursuing voting rights very vigorously. I can say that, you remember the census case last June when the Supreme Court threw out on a 5-4 vote the citizenship question? The purported rationale for including that question was to help the Department of Justice in bringing Voting Rights Act Section 2 lawsuits. So far, the Trump department has brought 0 of those lawsuits in the 3 years. And in terms of sending observers to the polls, I don't see the Justice Department being very active in that at all. And in fact, just one more thing on the partisan level here. Since 1982, the Republican National Committee was under a court order called a consent decree, which said that they could not engage in so-called ballot security activities, that is, sending people to polling places like off-duty police officers to patrol, because that was found to intimidate voters. In 2017, that consent decree expired, and the Democrats asked for it to be extended, and that was denied. So we're going to have the first election now, 2020, not only without the Department of Justice likely sending observers, not only without the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but also where this consent decree is gone. And so I'm worried about problems at the polling places themselves.
Are they allowed to carry guns?
That's a state law question. You're not allowed to intimidate voters under federal law, but whether or not you're allowed to bring guns to polling places is a state law question.
Okay, now you got me depressed.
All right.
I guess, do we have time for one more question? Yeah.
So I'm a little familiar with the work of Mark Elias at Perkins Coie on some of these lawsuits. I don't know him. And so I read about a lot of this going on. And I guess my question to you is there enough oversight in that way? Because I don't think, I've been an election judge in Montgomery County, and the observation that you talked about, oversight on election day is probably more true in presidential swing states or contentious close governor races and Senate races. A lot of the smaller office, Maryland doesn't usually have a lot going on contentious. So I don't know how much of that is in those kind of races. But my question for you is this kind of activism, the Democratic Party at least, is it enough? I mean, is there that kind of oversight? Will we at least be likely to know if there are problems?
Well, so lawsuits are being brought now by the Democratic Party and those allied with the Democratic Party. Mark Elias, as you mentioned, he's I got like maybe almost 24 lawsuits going about all kinds of rules about counting absentee ballots and purging voters, all kinds of things that sometimes fly under the radar. It's going to be up to the federal courts to decide when these claims are acceptable. And I think on these issues, the courts are divided. And sometimes I think Mark overreaches and he actually wins some of the suits. For example, he claimed that when Ohio moved from 35 days of early voting to 28 days of early voting, that was unconstitutional. And 28 days of early voting is 28 days of early voting more than they have in New York. So, I mean, I think he's been very aggressive. They've done a lot of fundraising. That's just one piece of the puzzle. They're not suing over everything. Not all of this is about suing, right? So they're looking at the so-called suppressive issues, but that's just one piece of it.
And what do you think about election night in terms of the Democrats' oversight in at least the states that are?
They've got tons of money. You know, the other thing about claims of voter suppression is that it's good for fundraising. So Democrats are well stocked, I think. Both parties are going to be ready to. They have Mark Elias literally has a plane ready to go to take him to the place that he needs to go. So I don't think that's going to be the issue. The issue is going to be some kind of, if there is an issue, it's going to be some kind of problem that was not foreseeable or could have been prevented before the election.
Well,
So thank you all for being here. Let's have a round of applause for our presenters.